Jeanne Kitchens, Chief Technology Services Officer with Credential Engine. Thank you for watching Pathway Planning and Analysis. We're going to talk about how to prepare for building your pathways with the Pathway Builder and conclude with additional resources. Pathways come in many different shapes and sizes. These are some examples, and I'm sure you have many more and possibly different formats. We see pathways that could be listed in spreadsheets, in PDF documents, lists on web page, posters, various types of images. So regardless of the format of a pathway that you are designing or have designed, you can use the Pathway Builder to create transparent data about that pathway. So to prepare for building pathways, there are a few things that you'll need to do, to have ready, or to discuss maybe with your team to effectively build or design pathways. First, you'll want to have a pre-designed pathway or a framework. You can use the Pathway Builder to design a new pathway. However, you should have a plan for that pathway in advance of using the Pathway Builder and have some idea of what that pathway should look like. You'll need to do some analysis and planning. Pathways can range from being very simple to just a small number of pathway components towards a destination, or they can be very complex. For example, I can think about degree pathways for, say, a bachelor's degree can be a very large and complex pathway. No matter the size of the pathway, whether or not it's a pre-designed pathway or a framework for a pathway that you are in process of designing, analysis and planning is critical. You will want to identify your pathway components and resources. So with the Pathway Builder and with CTDL, we're very specifically talking about the pathway component classes and resources that you can publish to the registry and the components that you can use to build your pathway on the Pathway Builder board. Ahead of building your pathway, whenever possible, publish your pathway resources to the Credential Registry. This can include credentials, assessments, it can even include jobs, courses, the types of information that you want to include in your pathway. If you publish it to the Credential Registry, that data will be ready for you to build your pathway with. Determine if a progression model is needed. A progression model provides additional information about the levels in which components become aligned in your pathway. This can be very, very useful. It's not always needed for a pathway, but when a progression model makes sense to use, it can add additional information to your pathway that is very helpful to you as you're building it, and to the people that need to understand your pathway after you build it. By having a pre-designed pathway or a framework, publishing pathway components to the registry, analyzing the progression requirements and planning accordingly, you will be well equipped to efficiently design and build your pathways with the Pathway Builder. So for a pre-designed pathway or general framework, again, it could come in many different formats. And so what you want to have is your picture, maybe a Miro board, maybe a spreadsheet, whatever that format is. You'll want to think about what are the components that comprise this pathway, so you can represent it with CTDL terms and publish that information for transparency. So let's take a look at some of the additional analysis and planning considerations for pathway construction. When you're planning your pathway, you're going to define a destination for your pathway. With CTDL, that's going to be a single component. The destination could be a job, for example. The destination could be a credential, as another example. It's up to you what that destination should be. Pathway components, you're going to identify the specific components needed to progress toward the destination. And with the Pathway Builder, you can, on the fly, create those components. But again, having your analysis done in advance, having a good sense of what components are needed, such as, for example, are courses needed to complete your pathway? Is work experience needed? Assessments, credentials, and so forth. So you'll want to think about and identify pathway components needed to progress toward the destination. Combination of resources. You can mix and match resources. So, for example, maybe you have a pathway that consists of resources offered by your organization and, for example, certifications offered by another organization. If you're going to have a combination of resources, you can do that with the Pathway Builder. You can mix and match resources offered by your organization as well as others. You'll want to start thinking through a sequence. You're going to establish a type of logical sequence for achieving the pathway. There could be pathways could have, on-off ramps. They could start in different points depending on where a person might, be in terms of the pathway. But you'll want to think about a logical sequence. And progression levels, you want to decide if progression levels are applicable or not. A pathway is a progression toward a destination, so that is inherent in building your pathway. But if additional information about specific progression levels are needed, that will enhance the pathway structure. You'll want to have a good idea for what those progression levels will be, and you'll want to publish those in advance of building your pathway. Completion requirements. When you're building your pathway with the Pathway Builder, you do not have to include conditions, the details about conditions. You can show the pathway through connectors that are arrows. But if you want to describe your pathway in more detail and include more specific requirements about successfully completing the pathway, you can do that with the Pathway Builder. That is very useful information. So as I mentioned, that has to do with levels of expression. There are 3 levels of expression with the Pathway Builder, where you can use connectors to show a progression to a destination. The second level would be including conditions, where you describe some of the requirements for completing a pathway. And the third level would be constraints that further refine the requirements with conditions. The list is not exhaustive, but it is a good starting point for you and your team to get together and start thinking about planning for building pathways. And this is a list of the pathway components and resources. So these are currently the types of components that you can build your pathway with, and related data for these components, in most cases, can be published to the registry as well. So if you have existing pathways in various formats, then the first step is to publish your data about the pathway components to the Credential Registry. This includes credentials, courses, competencies, jobs, and other relevant components that are part of the pathway, and make sure you include the final destination component. You can use a Credential Registry publishing tool that suits your needs. We have multiple tools available for you to use that range from manual entry to bulk upload to using our API. Whichever way you want to go is fine. No matter which way you publish, that data will be available for you to build your pathway with the Pathway Builder. And it's also worth noting that in some cases, for example, if you are in process of designing a pathway and so it's not feasible to publish to the Credential Registry first, there are some components that you can publish on the fly while building your pathway, and that includes assessments, courses, and credentials. When you're looking at whether or not a progression model is needed, you'll want to think about whether or not it is useful to include additional information across, for example, grades, levels, stages, or time. In education, we can often think about progressions through time, through like semesters or quarters, but we can also think about progressions as, for example, levels, beginner level, intermediate, advanced level. The designers of the pathways come up with their own progression model and their own levels. There are no requirements for any specific levels to be included with your pathway. As part of your analysis, if you determine that a progression model is needed, then you would need to publish that before starting your pathway. That is a requirement that you would need to publish that to the Credential Registry first. That concludes our video, and multiple additional resources are available to you. All of these additional resources are available through the Credential Engine website, through the help located in the Pathway Builder as well, and the videos are on YouTube. Thank you for watching.